Hello, I am Tom De Mayo, and I am the current lore provost for the Troth's lore program. This is part of a series of videos on the sources for our understanding of pre-conversion uh, heathenry, of basically of the Germanic paganisms. This video is going to be about the Icelandic sagas. The Icelandic sagas are a series of narratives that are written really starting in kind of the High Middle Ages and continuing on through the Late Middle Ages and beyond, are a series of narratives, of stories, essentially. The word saga is related to the word for to say. And so they are basically tales, and they're prose tales, and they come in a variety of subgenres. The Icelandic family sagas are probably the most important for us, and they are basically narratives about kind of the first generation of Icelandic colonists and then their descendants after the land taking and down, usually taking the stories down a little bit after the conversion. So the very earliest sort of semi-legendary founders of Iceland. And in the course of this, it describes what I guess the medieval Icelanders thought uh, pre conversion society was like, what they remembered from their oral histories, and what they needed to tell a good story, and quite possibly um, they may have added, embellished, or changed a great many things. But they do provide a good source of data about uh, pre-conversion heathenry, even if using it and figuring out what can be considered kind of accurate and what can't is difficult or maybe even impossible. There are other genres of sagas too. The next most important for our purposes are the what are sometimes called the legendary sagas or the sagas of olden times, the Fornaldir saga, which are basically about the legendary kind of past, particularly the migration age, where some of them retell a number of stories that seem to come from the continent and that are related to similar stories that we get in other branches of Germanic literature, for example, Beowulf or some of the continental German heroic poetries. And it's mixed in basically with anything that's kind of adventurous and fantastical that doesn't take place in a clearly historical time and place, but people who go off to legendary lands in the north part of Russia or to other parts of the Mediterranean, and you start getting knightly romance type stuff from the continent being translated and brought into uh, the Icelandic sagas as well. So the sagas of olden times, the legendary sagas, with things like Ragnar Lothbrok's story or whatever, they are probably even less reliable maybe than the family sagas, but they still also contain important bits of mythology and so forth that may or may not be handed down from the Viking Age. Then there are a number of other branches of sagas. The King's sagas are basically sagas about the kings of Scandinavia. Um, Many of these are collected in a book called the Heimskringla, which is a huge compilation of stuff about basically the kings of Norway, uh, probably done by Snorri Sturluson, the same guy who wrote the Edda. Then you have the bishop sagas that are about the conversion and about the early kind of heroic Icelandic bishops. And you have sagas about somewhat later politics and the transformation of Iceland from a commonwealth or republic that was independent to its becoming part of the kingdom of Norway, called the uh, Sturlus sagas, which are about the Sturling family that Snorri Sturluson actually belonged to. And so there's a whole lot of material in the Icelandic sagas, and they don't lay out in a systematic way the mythology or the heroic legends or practices from pre-conversion times in a simple, easy to absorb format. They're kind of scattered in the background of the sagas, and we're never quite sure exactly how much reliability to give them. The sagas are usually pretty easy to read for a modern English speaking audience. The sagas are written in a pretty straightforward style, unlike much of the secular literature that's coming out of places on the continent, like the Arthurian romances or the Chassol de Guest or whatever. The sagas tend to be terse, and they tend to have a very externalized point of view. The narrator rarely comments on what's going on in the saga, and people's actions and words are described, often in direct dialogue, without really dipping into the interior thoughts of the characters. So much of what they do and why they do it, you have to kind of infer from their behavior and their speeches in the saga. And this is an amazing level of restraint, really. And so and the conventions that come out of this, the sort of the shorter sentences, direct dialogue, description, and so forth, is an awful lot like modern novel conventions, probably coincidentally. But as a result, you can pick up editions of these sagas in English translations and just kind of start reading them as though they were a novel. And there'll only be a couple places probably where the sort of medievalness of them comes through, and you recognize that they're following different stylistic conventions than we'd use today. The most important of these, as I said, are probably the family sagas, and these tell the story of the different Icelandic families and their main characters who settle in different parts of Iceland during the so-called land taking. And then usually they trace from this founding generation to a second or third generation and what happens with them. And so a lot of it is about causality and conflicts over land or power or religion that start off in the during the initial settlement are then traced through basically chains of causality and response through the different characters to the end of the saga. And usually they straddle the heathen period and the conversion to Christianity. And so you also get you get a contrast between the pagan society and then what's becoming a Christian society, and supposedly how Christianity affects the major characters as they change their religious orientation. The most famous of these sagas is probably Njál's saga, which is about a settler named Njál who is presented in a lot of ways like a Christian saint full of restraint, and he's basically tries to avoid and then gets inexorably pulled into the tit for tat feuding culture of pagan Iceland, which eventually results in him being assassinated. His enemies set fire to his house and he burns up. And for that reason, it's sometimes called the Saga of Burnt Njál. Probably also of considerable interest to modern heathens is Egil's saga, who was from a slightly different family. And Egil and his family seem to have these supernatural kind of Odinic qualities to them. One of his ancestors is basically a werewolf, and members of his family also have enormous strength, and both of those are basically tied in with the Hammer, which is a kind of projected soul that shows up in a lot of Norse uh, mythological lore. That is, so the anger and the strength is connected with the shape shifting, and maybe you could also say spirit projection. And Egil himself is versed in the runes and the spoken magic. He's a famous poet, and he's also he goes around the North Atlantic world and fights on behalf of the King of England, and gets involved with a bunch of famous and important people. He has a kind of a feud with uh, Eric Bloodaxe, uh, who at one point rules from York. Um, and so that's a very interesting saga. And Egil is kind of more of an anti-hero, maybe, than Njal is. Another one that is probably of great interest to heathens is Grettir's saga, which is about basically he's supposed to be the strongest man in Iceland, and he gets involved in these feuding structures, these feuds that are going on, and he eventually becomes exiled and is eventually killed as an exile. And it sort of explores him not only being potentially very heroic, but also very disruptive to society, and also kind of forced out beyond the periphery of the human world, where he interacts with a number of trolls and other kinds of magical figures, and his kind of uncontrollable uh, anger and his strength lead kind of to his own downfall. So a lot of these are sort of character studies. Maybe the one that I'm most interested in is the saga of Viga Gloom, or Gloom the Murderer, who is basically a kind of a minor chieftain, and he goes to Norway as a young man and connects with some relatives who seem to have been part of an Odinic, uh, what do I want to say, family or cult or tradition. And he sort of receives a supernatural blessing from his relative back in Norway. And he comes back and he basically regains a whole bunch of importance for his chieftaincy, and displaces the other guy in this section of the other most important political character in his section of Iceland, who is a phrase man. And Viga Gloom makes a number of killings, and he rises up basically to become a fairly powerful chieftain. And then it kind of all collapses on him as the phrase people and the phrase man basically, and Frey basically get their revenge on him. And it's a very interesting saga, because the supernatural elements of the saga, and in particular the causation involving the gods and their worship, is kind of always presented through a naturalistic sort of surface. And so you see the working out of different kinds of destinies and orientations, but there's always a more proximate social or physical cause for the changes that are going on. So the kind of cycle of Odinic ambition, success, and then downfall, Viga undertakes these with basically concrete political acts and killings and actions in the human world, but through dreams and suggestion, it's strongly implied that there's this basically uh, intercultic struggle between Freysmen and Odinsmen going on, or at least that's one of the more prominent scholarly interpretations. The King's sagas hold are interesting because the Heimskringla includes a couple of early sagas about the mythological or legendary first kings of Sweden, starting off with Odin and going through the other Norse gods who are presented as human kings. And this sets up the lineage of the kings of Norway. And the Ynglinga saga, really the first in this sequence, which is also written by Snorri Sturluson, we think, is goes through the different Norse gods again through this kind of this euhemeristic lens, and gives a different formulation, slightly different formulation of their powers and their importance and what sorts of things they influenced. In particular, it's got a really detailed section on Odin and his magical powers. Another one that's probably worth reading is the Saga of Olaf Tryggvason, where this convert king to Christianity is visited by an apparition, essentially, of Odin. And again, you get this sense of supernatural forces at work behind a rather thin veil of natural human cause and effect. The legendary sagas are basically a kind of a hodgepodge of all kinds of fantastic adventures. And they tend to have much more of the supernatural. People are pretty much fighting trolls and things all the time. And they're far less grounded than, say, the Icelandic family sagas. But they do have a lot of material that seems to have continued down into medieval Iceland from older Germanic storytelling conventions. They also have a bunch of stuff that comes in from the continent too. Maybe the best example of this type of saga is the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, which our own Ben Wagner has translated into English. And Ragnar is only a semi-historical figure, and he was the main character on the Vikings TV show. But he goes on all kinds of fantastic adventures in this story. He fights a dragon, and he conquers a couple of countries, and it's a lot of it is, I guess the right word is fantastical, rather than likely to be historical. And all of these, there is, again, the central question when we analyze any of the written sources of our lore is how much of this is authentically from the Viking Age, and how much is a later creation or based on assumptions of a Christian storyteller and an audience that aren't really what it would have been like at the time. And the general consensus among scholars is that the Icelandic sagas were created for this medieval Christian audience. And many of them are masterpieces of a storytelling art, but you can't just take what they say about the Viking Age straight. You have to filter it through other sources, and there's always a degree of uncertainty about the information that it reveals. So, with the sagas, this is another sort of interesting but sprawling set of stories. And I think that maybe for modern heathens, the important thing about the sagas, particularly the family sagas, is that they are in some ways sort of the first attempt to reconstruct what it must have been like to live in the pagan Viking age. The people who are writing and telling these stories are all already Christian, and the transition from pagan to Christian is a major theme in many of the sagas. But they are also thinking about their ancestors, which they continue to regard very highly, and as an kind of important part. These stories are kind of an important part of the cultural patrimony, uh, and so the family sagas are in some ways kind of doing a shared universe or maybe a reconstruction as a best guess of what these storytellers, who are a lot closer to the original information than we are, and may have had access to various kinds of oral sources, what they thought their ancestors, the actual pre-conversion heathens, what their lives were like and what motivated them. And we see the kind of matrix of revenge and honor and struggle for political power that gives us an idea kind of how this pagan society might have operated. So, for example, Jesse Byock's book, Viking Age Iceland, goes through a number of the sagas and looks at them from a kind of a sociological standpoint and about the use and employment of power between different social classes and the transformations that took place in Icelandic society. So that's what I wanted to say about the sagas. I may come back and treat particular sagas or genres of sagas in greater depth uh, later, but this gives you a sense of how they fit into the sources of our lore.